Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Aquarium's Summer Kids Club. Good to have all of our ocean rangers back with us again today. My name is Luke. Haven't been here in a while. It's nice to be back with you all. I hope you're enjoying our shows so far today. If you've already been watching, if not, we have this and a few more shows scheduled for the day. And this program in the 11 o'clock hour is going to be really, really interesting because we are going to be talking about a place that very, very, very few people have ever been, and that is the deep sea. We are going to be discussing how animals survive in that environment, what that environment looks like, what it might feel like, and what are some of the weird challenges that animals have to face there. And we're going to be comparing it a lot with the areas of the ocean that we are a lot more familiar with, the areas that we get to visit more easily or get to make basically models of, I guess you could say, here at the aquarium, with things like Shark Lagoon right behind me. Now, just like with all of our other Summer Kids Club shows, you can text us any questions you might have. If you want to text us, if you have a question, Talia is at the computer, and she will be passing those questions on to me. Also, Stacy is here helping out with the videos. So we've got lots of brains here for this program. And this program, by the way, is called Ask a Scientist. And we have a lot of scientists that we can talk to here at the aquarium. But whenever I want to teach this program, I always feel, whoa, hello, shark. I always sometimes feel a little awkward when I have to teach the Ask a Scientist program because, technically speaking, I'm not exactly a scientist in the way that most people think of a scientist. You think of a scientist, right? You think of somebody living in, or working in a lab, or somebody out in nature studying and collecting samples and so on. We're going to be talking about a lot of that work today. But my job has always been to teach about science. But just because you might not be professionally spending your entire day working in a laboratory or studying animals, looking through binoculars at lions or whatever, or scuba diving and collecting interesting specimens under the water, that doesn't mean that you can't think like a scientist and behave like a scientist in many ways. And this doesn't mean you can't learn and understand science and use it in all sorts of ways in your life. So I think of myself as a scientist in a sort of a bigger way than that, maybe more of a science-ist in some ways, because I think that science is such a useful thing in my life, and I think that sharing it and learning more about it is so helpful. And I've been doing it for quite a while here at the aquarium, so I've gotten to learn from a lot of scientists. Now, let's talk a little bit about the habitat that you see behind me. Remember, you can text in any questions or observations as we go here at 562-286-1838. And also, you can email us at live@lbaop.org. We usually check that after the program, though, so if you want to get live answers during our show, be sure to use the text number. Now, this habitat that we're looking at here, right? Now, this is just Shark Lagoon here at the aquarium, so this isn't a real coral reef environment, but it's kind of a good example of the kind of place that we know pretty well in the ocean, I guess you might say, right? You might have heard before that some people say things like 90% of the ocean is unexplored or 99% of the ocean is unexplored. Because sometimes we think of exploring as having actually been to a specific spot, right? Or having mapped it perfectly and knowing exactly what's there. And it really is true that although when we're on the coast, we know an awful lot about what's under the water, as you get deeper and farther out, we find more and more surprises and we learn new things every time we go. So before we go to those mysterious places that science is just in the last few years really getting to explore more thoroughly, let's talk about the places that we've been exploring for a long time. What is it like for most of the animals that we see in the ocean or in a place like the aquarium, the kinds of animals that we show here, right? They live in shallow water. Now, they might live in a cold place or a warm place. This particular habitat is a relatively warm place, about 76 degrees. But if they live in a shallow water environment, right, there's lots of light around. They can tell when it's day. They can tell when it's night. And there's also, in addition to the animals themselves, lots of organisms that use that sunlight, and that's a big source of energy for all the animals that live there, right? In fact, it's the source from which all other energy eventually, comes, right? The sun is the number one thing that brings energy to our planet that life then processes and turns into different forms that other kinds of life forms, like, say, ourselves, can use. I can't get fed by, sitting under a sun lamp, but a plant can grow using energy from sunlight, right? And then we eat plants, and other animals eat animals, and so on, and it goes up from there. So this is very important that this is a well-lit place, right? And that the Earth has sunlight. And yet, organisms have figured out ways to survive in the total absence of sunlight. There are organisms all the way down to the deepest, deepest, deepest places in the ocean. And that's really deep. When I'm talking deepest here, if you go down to the deepest spot in the ocean, it's about 36,000 feet under the ocean surface. That's so deep that if you took Mount Everest from sea level to the top and dropped it in the ocean right there, its peak would still be about a mile underwater. So the deepest parts of the ocean are very deep indeed. Now, let's have a look at one of those deep environments. Ooh, I like that we started on this, because when you first explored the deep ocean, or when we first started trying to explore the deep ocean, a lot of scientists didn't expect to find much down there. Now, this is a long time ago I'm talking here. I'm talking like 100 years ago or so, or maybe even a little bit more recently. Scientists would say, there's not going to be anything down there. It's going to be so dark, it's going to be so cold, there's not going to be any oxygen in the water for the animals to breathe and so on, that they just figured there really wouldn't be much down there. And so this view, which looks a little bleak, I guess, to start off with, is what a lot of scientists expected. And indeed, there are many places in the deep ocean that look pretty featureless. Most of the most active places in the ocean are closer up to the surface because, like we said, that's where the sunlight is, that's where the energy is, right? But so much of what happens at the surface of the ocean doesn't stay there. Much of what happens at the surface of the ocean eventually, at some point, sinks. Animals at the surface, right, they're eating and hunting and pooping and all these things. So all that stuff that the animals leave behind, whether it's because they're even just something silly like going to the bathroom, or because they die or anything like that, that stuff eventually moves through other parts of the ocean, and if it gets over a place that's deep, much of it eventually sinks and sinks and sinks and sinks. So when you get to the bottom of the ocean, if you know how to use it, if you're an animal that maybe has developed adaptations that allow you to survive down there, there's actually plenty of nutrients and stuff that you can work from to build an ecosystem. And sometimes there's even other sources of energy that lead to some of the really, really interesting places where some really crazy stuff happens in the deep sea. Now, before we go to some of these places, I should warn you, the deep sea is a weird place with some, I'm going to be a little honest, some slightly spooky animals in it. But just keep in mind that they don't know that they're spooky. They didn't decide to look that way, They live in a place that's so dark, nobody can see anything anyway most of the time. So they're like, oh, what does it matter? But we're definitely going to be exploring some places that are a little bit creepy and interesting. But that's why we got to go there, because they're interesting, right? So let's start with, I'm hesitant if I should start with this. But let's start with, we'll start with something that's pretty cool and fun. Let's go explore a place where there is some extra energy in the deep ocean. Let's go check out hydrothermal vents. Now, like I said, right, in the deep ocean, the normal source of energy for things, the sun, isn't really available, right? Sunlight doesn't get down there. It's dark all the time. And like I also said, they figured animals in the deep ocean wouldn't be able to survive or whatever because there just wasn't any energy to use. But sometimes animals can find other sources of energy. And this hydrothermal vent here is a great example. You see these big plumes coming up here? This is very, very deep in the ocean on a place where the seafloor is very thin. And there's, just like there is in volcanoes and hot springs and stuff on land, there's places where the heat inside the earth is able to get into the ocean itself through these hydrothermal vents. And this brings with it a lot of heat, which is one kind of energy that helps things to move faster in living things. And it also brings with it a lot of chemicals. All these different chemicals are in the water and in the soil and in the rocks of the earth, right? And they're getting constantly dissolved and recycled by this process where all this heat's bubbling up out of these things. And this allows all sorts of chemical processes and things to start happening. So there might be some bacteria that can actually use these chemicals that are present in the water to start to grow and build themselves, right? Then there's other organisms that have figured out how to live by using these bacteria. One of my favorites is these things. You see these white tubes with red fluffy tips? I think we have a picture that goes in a little closer. And by the way, this is a survey here, so you can see the parts of a collection device there, and looks like a submersible robot over there on the other side, or it might be part of another thing that was left there to take some measurements. I think we have a closer view of these tube worms at some point. What about the one with all the crabs hanging out on them? We might be able to find one, but anyway. Oh, here we go. So, but this works too. So this is a different environment. but the same kinds of worms or very similar worms are present. Look at these things. They have these white tubes they grow in, right? There's a lot of worms in the ocean that instead of digging tunnels, build them around themselves. We call them tube worms. And the crazy thing about those tube worms is that they don't really have any way to eat, per se. At least not in the traditional sense that we think of. You know, normally when we think an animal eats, right, you think that it takes food, it puts it in its mouth or something, and then it swallows it and digests it, right? Instead, the tube worms have a relationship with those bacteria I was talking about. In places where there's enough nutrients present in the water that those bacteria are able to perform chemosynthesis. They're able to make energy and make new chemicals and stuff themselves using the resources that are available. These worms grow and collect those bacteria in their bodies. And in turn, the worms are able to just survive off of that. And they grow over time building these tubes. And this is the great thing about, you know, when one animal figures out a way to use a resource or use something like, say, the energy from a hydrothermal vent or the nutrients around this, which is actually a cold vent, a cold seep in the ocean, other animals then are going to be like, oh, well, maybe this place isn't so bad after all, right? So Mr. Crab here, he doesn't have any way to naturally survive on his own from chemosynthesis or nutrients that are just floating around in the water. He has to somehow find a way to find food that he can naturally catch and digest. So now that there's something growing here around this cold seep, suddenly this is a place where other kinds of organisms might want to come in and live too. So you find different kinds of corals growing, these deep sea corals that work a lot differently from the ones near the surface. You find animals coming along, they're trying to nibble on maybe these tube worms. Sometimes in these places you'll see the crabs with their claw just try to grab it like this. And the tube worms will go in whenever the crab tries to do that. But every once in a while it works and the crab catches one. So this leads to the development of a whole ecosystem. And it's not just worms and crabs. Eventually in these places you can also find lots and lots of different kinds of fish and even sharks and all sorts of interesting things. And when you get up to that point, where we're looking at things that are, you know, vertebrates, a little bit more like ourselves, because we're vertebrates too. We have a lot more in common with a fish than you do with a tube worm. Right? Oh, here's a picture, finally. Look at these things. So this is the up-close view of what these tube worms look like. You can see that big, bushy red thing. So they're just taking advantage of the bacteria that are present in their environment and using them inside their own bodies, along with the energy that you can literally see the heat in the water. See how it's rippling, like waves of heat coming up off the pavement on a hot day? That's distortion due to the movement of the water and due to heat. And you can see these worms are able to obviously grow and survive in this environment. And by the way, this environment's crazy hot. When you're this close to the hydrothermal vent, you might be in water that's a couple hundred degrees. Right at the mouth of the vent itself, it's like, it could be 600-700 degrees. But as you get, because the water goes up so quickly, it cools pretty rapidly as you move away. So you'll see animals that are not able to, there'll be animals that can live right up to the edge. Other organisms that have to be a little bit farther off. Other organisms that have to be farther than that. And so there were those tube worms. But what was I saying? Oh yeah, we were going to move on up to fish, which oftentimes are some of the most fascinating and fun creatures of the deep sea. Let's have a look at a collection of deep sea fish, which I think we have a picture that has a lot of them in it. Bring that up there and just take a look at them for a moment. See if you see any interesting adaptations. Now remember, an adaptation, right, is a body part that a living thing has, or an ability that it has that helps it to survive. And basically every part of a living thing is an adaptation in one way or another. The challenge for us as scientists, whether we're practicing science and publishing about it in journals and stuff, or we're just doing it at home, is how can we figure out what those body parts might be for? How are they adaptations? So what do we see here? This is a variety of deep sea fish. I believe we have a couple of different angler fish here. You see these ones with the weird thing sticking out of their nose? That's a kind of lure. There's a lot of different species of deep sea anglerfish. Here's another one down here. We have a hatchet fish. This is a real weird one. See all those things on the bottom? Those are little photophores, they're called. They produce light. And then we've got, what is this, a flashlight fish, I think? That also has a photophore right there. And actually, while we're on the topic of organs that produce light, the anglerfish oftentimes have them in their little lures as well. Now, what are some things you notice that these deep sea fish all seem to have in common? Well, here's one adaptation I've noticed. Look at those teeth. There's quite a few of them here that have pretty gnarly teeth. And although you can't tell in this picture, usually it's very common for them to have pretty massive mouths, too. Much bigger mouths than on average, I think, than you find in a lot of other places in the ocean. Why is having a huge mouth a big advantage if you're in a dark place? Well, think about it. How does an anglerfish live? What do they do with their time? This fish right here, or that fish up there, basically makes its living by just floating along. As I said, there's energy to be had, and there's food to be had in the deep sea, but it's rarer than it is in a natural environment, right? So sorry, not a natural environment, than the sunlit environment closer to the surface. So, if you're, for a lot of animals closer to the surface can find a lot of food, so it's worth it to go out hunting and actively chasing it around and stuff. But if you're in the deep sea, you're going to have a hard time chasing your food around because, well, you can't see anything, and food's not that common. So you're probably going to waste a lot of energy before you even find food. So instead, what a lot of these deep sea organisms do is they basically just sort of wait for something useful to come along and more or less get close enough that they can just wrap their enormous mouth around it. So the anglerfish here have huge mouths, right? And they sit there waiting, and maybe they blink their little lure a little bit, create a little flicker of light so maybe some other animal thinks, oh, is that something I could eat? I'm going to go check that out. And then when that animal gets close enough, the anglerfish opens up its mouth really, really wide and swallows the whole thing at once. And they don't want to waste energy, so they just sort of move very slowly, take it easy, follow the current, wait for some lucky prey item to come by. Now, Eli had a question. Do these fish glow in the dark? Yes, they do, Eli. A lot of them do, and they do this for a variety of different reasons. We just mentioned one, having a little lure here on its nose. Where am I pointing here? Well, there we go. Right, so having a little lure right there on its nose is one way that you can glow and use light to help you under the water. That's to help to lure in prey. Other fish use light for other reasons. They might use it to signal to each other in their school. And they also sometimes can use it to camouflage themselves. One of my favorites is the hatchetfish here. The hatchetfish, see all those little stripes on the bottom? Those are actually individual little glow-in-the-dark spots on its body. They're basically these little pockets that are full of these bacteria that produce light. And the hatchetfish can control more or less exactly how much light those bacteria are, or how much of that light is visible from those bacteria at any given time. And they do this so that they can camouflage themselves in areas that aren't so deep that it's perfectly dark, but in areas that are just getting to the point where there's only a little light coming from above. Now, why would it do that? Think about it, right? If you're a fish that lives in the ocean regularly, oftentimes you see a lot of animals that have what we call counter shading, right? Where the back is darker and the bottom is lighter. This is a good plan for a lot of fish in the ocean because if you look at, say, a shark from the bottom, and it's a shallow water shark, when you look up, you'll see the sky above it, and its white belly will blend in with that light coming up from above. And if you look down, its darker back will blend in with the water below it or the ground below it or whatever it might be. Now, the hatchetfish here is mostly just hanging out in the middle of the water. No, there's no ground nearby or anything. But it tends to live right in that zone that's just between the area where it gets completely dark and where there's still some light. And so what the hatchetfish does is it has a dark back, so that its dark back blends in with the ground, with the deep, deep ocean water below it. And then on its belly, it has photophores that imitate the amount of light coming down from above. So when you look up at a hatchetfish, what you see, instead of the shape of the fish, instead of a shadow, you see what looks like just more of the same exact amount of light coming down from the sun that's, up there maybe 1,000 feet above the surface or something. So it blends in, it countershades itself to adapt to these different lighting situations. It's a really interesting way to use it. And then there's also lots of animals in the deep ocean that glow in the dark as a way to avoid predators. There's a shrimp called the pandalid. That's an interesting one. Check this out. So this little shrimp here, right, has, dangers in its life. And if you're a pandalid shrimp, the last thing you want is somebody to come. You don't have to be a pandalid shrimp. Nobody wants to be eaten, right? But how do you defend yourself if you're a pandalid shrimp? haven't got crazy big teeth, haven't got giant, monstrous razor-sharp claws necessarily. What if something tries to attack you, you just try to really confuse them? So you've got predators in the deep ocean, right, that are constantly going around in the darkness looking for things to eat. And many of these predators are used to the darkness. So what the pangolin does is once something gets close to it, it sort of does the opposite of camouflaging itself. It rather shocks its predator with a burst of this glow-in-the-dark stuff it shoots out into the water. Basically, it has a packet of light-producing bacteria inside of its body, just like the fish do, but instead of keeping it inside its body all the time, what this guy does is basically discharge a cloud of that into the water. And when this pangolin shrimp does this, it's such a weird sudden cloud of light everywhere that any animal trying to attack it would be very disoriented, and it gives the shrimp hopefully a chance to get away. Crazy, huh? And so there's a lot of different reasons why animals in the deep ocean glow in the dark. Now, for the last part of our program, we're going to go to, well, I think maybe the spookiest place we've gone to so far in the deep sea. And because I mentioned earlier on, right, that in the shallow ocean, animals get, the basic source of energy for most things is the sun, and then it moves into the ecosystem and so on. In the deep ocean, I said, there's not so many energy sources. There's the occasional hydrothermal vent. But other than that, you're really just depending on whatever stuff falls down from above. And what's the biggest thing that could fall down from above in the ocean that might be a good food source for deep sea animals? Well, how about a whale? What happens to a whale at the end of its life? You've probably heard before about beached whales. And sometimes whales will wash up on a beach after they pass away. Other times, they sink. And when they do, they become an incredibly important food source that can support a whole bunch of different kinds of animals for years. So we're going to take a look deep, and we're going to go in slow. I think I like it better this way. Oh, too much, too bad. That's fine. So we're going to take a close look at this. Check this out. Now you'll see some information popping up on the screen here. This was discovered during a dive. Let's just pause it for a second. Yeah, there we go. This was discovered during a dive to the deep sea floor. And by the way, you can watch this on YouTube. To the deep sea floor around Monterey Bay in a national marine sanctuary. And this is, it's something. Like, I don't know. I'm sure some of you at home might be. Trust me, when I first saw this, I was like, I don't know if I like this. But it's actually pretty fascinating. And here's why, right? All these animals, so many of these animals, there's different kinds of octopuses, there's different kinds of fish, there's worms, which we'll get to in a minute, live in an environment where you go a long time sometimes without finding anything useful to eat, and then what you're really looking for is big jackpot food items that you might be able to survive on for a long time, either because you can stuff yourself and take as much with you as you can, or because, in some cases, maybe you can just continue to feed on that thing for a long time. So at some point, possibly several years before, this whale passed away and sank to the bottom of the ocean. That's a baleen whale, by the way. You can actually see some of the baleen in different parts here of the image. You can see by the shape of its head, too. Now, this whale passed away and sank to the bottom of the ocean. And that whale brought with it a whole bunch of potential food, because its body is a food resource. Everything in the ocean, in fact, in nature this is almost true, eventually gets used by something. And in this case, when this whale landed down here, pretty quickly, all sorts of animals would have found it, just tracked it down by the smell, and then started to feed on it. And these whale falls, if it's a big whale, can sometimes support a habitat for a decade or more, because it takes a long time for these slow-moving animals to eat and digest the whole thing. And as they do, different kinds of animals will show up, right? Because there's some animals that might be better at eating different parts of the whale than others. So let's take a close look at one of the final stages of this process. This whale is now at the point where even the bones of the whale itself are being consumed. You can see the octopus and stuff, right? They're mostly working on the joints and the remains of muscles and so, of the whale's muscle and blubber and things like that. Those eel-like fish are doing something similar. You can actually see some of them eating in this image here. But if we look around the bones that are visible by what was once the whale's mouth, what is all that fuzzy stuff? I don't know if I like it. Stacy here, who's with me, likes it. She thinks it's cool. I think it's cool too. Maybe it's just because I didn't have the right breakfast this morning, so I'm a little more queasy about this than I usually am. But let's have a close look. Wow! Oh my! What are those things? So let me tell you, my young friends, my Ocean Ranger Explorer friends, if you want to be a scientist and study something that there's a lot of good discoveries left to be made about, you should study worms in the ocean. Because wow, there are some weird, crazy worms out there that will just completely just blow people's minds when they see them. And this isn't even one of the most extreme, but it's certainly one of the spookiest. These are called bone worms. So, all this meat and stuff I was talking about on this whale, right? That stuff that, if an animal's got teeth and a mouth and stuff, it can chew and get its way into that and eat them, right? But one of the most valuable, nutrient-rich parts of an animal, and this is true for all vertebrates really, is their bones. The thing is that their bones are really hard, and most animals can't get in there to figure out how to eat the marrow on the inside. Bone worms, apparently, have figured out how to get through this hard shell and are able to actually digest the bones of the whale. And as they do this, of course, if any openings or anything like that open up, other animals might come kick them out of the way and try to eat some of that marrow. And so eventually all the available resources in this whale get consumed. There's a whole type of organism that just specifically, its entire life is just dedicated to digesting bones. And you can see that they grow almost like a weird red grass as they dissolve that bone. And this, like I said, this can go on for years. And at places like this, other whale falls, we'll see things like sleeper sharks and seven-gill sharks and stuff like that. There's all sorts of things that pop up at whale fall environments. And although it's pretty gnarly, by the way, this is the remains of its baleen. Reminds me of a gray whale. I don't know, but if they haven't determined yet, then I guess I won't make any guesses. Where was I? So, as this process goes on, yeah, this provides resources for these animals, and these is what they live on. So life has found its way to survive, even in what we might think is a very bleak environment, right? But that's what's so crazy about the deep ocean. We constantly are finding new, unexpected things in this place that in the past some scientists thought there might not be really much to look at in at all. And the kinds of adaptations that animals have to deal with the scarcity of food, the extreme pressure, the extreme cold, are really, really amazing in the deep sea environment. So we're almost out of time here. But before we go, do we have any questions? Have I just been babbling on too quickly? If you do have any last questions before we wrap up, by all means, let me know. If not, we can spend some more time enjoying the lovely, lovely view of this crab nibbling on this cold sea. Let's look at the one with the mussels, actually, while we're at it. Let's have a look at them. There's other kinds of things that can thrive in these places, too. This is a bunch of little white crabs that live on these mussels. I believe this is also around a hydrothermal vent, or is this one a cold seep? But these environments are usually, it's pretty common. There'll be something that's able to survive basically by using those bacteria that are performing chemosynthesis, and then there'll be some other animal that comes along and then tries to eat those things when possible. And in almost every one of these places you look at, crabs play a pretty important role. So these again are environments that we're always learning more about, and it's an amazing thing to study. And it is studied using a lot of stuff that's only been invented relatively recently, right? You've heard probably before of deep-sea ROVs, remotely operated vehicles that can explore the deepest places in the ocean. There's also some of those vehicles that can bring people to those areas as well, but most of the time it's easier to do it with a robot. So there are all sorts of ways for scientists to get involved in deep-sea ocean research. You might be a biologist who wants to study deep-sea jellies and ctenophores, or you might be a computer programmer who helps to program the robot that makes that thing work. Or you might be an engineer who designs the ways in which the machinery of the robot works. There's all sorts of different ways that different kinds of scientists, different kinds of, frankly, professionals can get involved in deep sea ocean research and engage in science. Oh, this is some cool stuff, right? We didn't even get to this, all the translucent and transparent animals in the deep ocean. We're just about out of time, but I think I have a question, so we're going to wait just a little longer here. We'd like to thank, by the way, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for all the wonderful footage that we got to look at here. And we have one last question coming in. What do we got here? Is this the environment where... Ooh, I think I see where this is going. All right, Eli had another question. Thanks, Eli. Is this the environment where giant squid live? Yes. So giant squid, from what... We don't know that much about giant squid because they've only been spotted a few times, even to this day, in spite of how hard we look for them. They're not that easy to locate. And giant squid, though, from what we can tell, are kind of in that same kind of strategy I mentioned with the anglerfish and stuff like that, where they mostly are kind of moving slowly through their environment, just kind of waiting for opportunities. And the giant squid basically probably doesn't want to waste a lot of energy, so it spends a lot of time just sort of going like, drift along here, doing my thing. Ooh, here's a giant squid. Oh, yeah, this is where it attacks the robot. This is great. You're like, I'm just a deep-sea exploration robot here, waving around my little, my glowy thing here. This is an attempt to actually lure a giant squid, and as you can see, it worked. So the giant squid's hanging out there in the dark, waiting for something to come along. It sees a glowy thing, and it's like, ooh, food. And you saw that, right? It came up, it touched it, and it was like, what is this? Is this food? No, it's not. And then it left. And that's a giant squid's life for you. Deep-sea animal, very, very big, but again, not aggressively, chasing down things all the time. Rather, a lot of times they're just sort of moving relatively slowly, saving energy, waiting for an opportunity for a big meal. Now, we are out of time at this point, so I want to thank everybody for joining us. And remember, we will be back again at 1 o'clock for a couple more programs this afternoon. We have a youth scientist program about kelp forests, and then we also have a squid dissection, I think, later at the end of the day. So if you want to see a couple more things, come back and join us at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock. Other than that, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us again for this episode of our program, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.